All right, that's time to move on to the next section. All right, so for everyone still with us, we've completed the basic version of the email and apps protection checklist. A little bit of Q&A. Now let's go into endpoint enrollment. I think endpoint enrollment is critical to security for SMBs. It's another area that I think maybe it's not overlooked, but it's usually not complete. When I talk to most customers that are SMBs, and I ask them, if they have control of the devices that access their network or their data, the answer is usually yes. But of course, great, right? It's great to hear. And I usually will ask them next for a list of devices that are allowed access to the environment. Most of the time there isn't a list, but sometimes I'll get a list. And usually my very next step is then to go have a look and see which devices are accessing the environment. Go run export a list and compare those two things in front of the customer. And universally, one is not like the other. So it's a great way to just start the discussion about the need for endpoint enrollment and endpoint protection, because it's quite common for a customer to in their mind there's maybe 30 computers accessing their network and their data on a regular basis, and maybe I'll hear okay, there's a few personal devices but not many, and I'll show them there's sometimes 5 to 10 times that much accessing the environment, and they have no idea what they are, and that's without security breach, right? It's just users have a lot of devices. I find that oftentimes company-owned devices are not enrolled correctly. There's often this, there's not as much oversight into this, and I think it is super important, because you can't protect what you can't see, you can't secure what you can't see. So not only do you have to have strong identity protection with MFA, you really do need visibility into what devices are accessing the environment. You need to know if those devices are healthy and patched, because unpatched devices, are just just a matter of time before some threat actor finds that device and gets on the device and disables the antivirus and hides their tracks. Especially if it's it's a server device, user device. A lot of partners are wondering or ask, what is the best way to enroll Windows devices or iOS devices and Android devices? How do I ensure that devices are enrolled correctly? How do I troubleshoot device enrollment? How do I ensure that only authorized users enroll devices and authorized devices get enrolled, right? So these are questions we try to address in the guide. Again, we're just going to go over the checklist portion here today. So here's our checklist. For endpoint enrollment, we want to begin by deciding which approach we want to take. iOS and Android devices can be managed either with MAM or MDM. And the difference is, MDM is full control of the device. We're going to control everything, and it's mostly appropriate for devices the company owns, where MAM or app management secures the app itself and has little interaction with the device. There is some, but it's especially appropriate for personal devices. So if we're securing MAM, or we're using MAM to secure the device, and we're only concerning ourselves with the apps people use to connect to the company data and the company data itself. And we're as the tenant's not concerned about personal data on the device, is not concerned or even to look at or be aware of text messages, other apps the employee may have on their personal device, pictures, etc., which are usually not very interesting to most SMBs, but also, a lot of lawyers tell me there's legal risk in having access to that type of personal data of employees if there's not a business reason. So many times lawyers advise, not to take control of things that the company doesn't own. That's a different story. If the company owns the device, they can set the rules. It's their device, and they can do as they choose. But we recommend MAM for personally owned devices and MDM for company-owned devices. This is pretty simple. And MAM is really easy to set up. So in some cases, I have customers that are, they want security, but they don't want to put a lot of effort into managing devices. MEM is actually a reasonable approach for even company-owned devices in some cases. We still recommend MDM, but I'd rather see MEM than nothing. It's often important, and it's an overlooked area to think about device enrollment restrictions. And the reason is, if we don't configure device enrollment restrictions, then that means when users start accessing the tenant, they'll be prompted to allow the organization to manage the device, and they'll be if we don't do anything about this, they'll sort of self-enroll themselves into MDM. So at a minimum, if you're going to use MEM, I recommend blocking personal enrollments. So we're sort of just having one management approach. It's very easy to do in the tenant. And then another area where device enrollment restrictions make sense is if a customer, doesn't intend to use a certain type of device at all. They standardize on, standardize on iOS, or they standardize on Android. They might want to just block the other devices from enrolling outright as well. Well, we recommend deploying app protection policies at a minimum. This is very easy to do. It doesn't require a lot of effort, and it does a great job at protecting the data on mobile devices, because it will only allow apps to connect to the data, meaning your email and files, if they're compliant and manageable. Second, it will make sure that the data that gets on the device, the company data, so the files and email, is encrypted. And if the user leaves the organization, they lose access to the unencryption keys. So, in the case where, let's say the company, has a lead salesperson and they leave the company, the salesperson may have been using their personal device, but if MEM is configured, they do not have access to the email after they leave the company, nor, if it's configured properly, nor would they have been able to save attachments and files in the email outside of the email or outside of the company control. If it was a MEM managed device, it would block it. However, if that same user was using Outlook and Word for personal use, those areas remained untouched. So they can use the same Outlook app to connect to company email and personal email. And if they leave the company email is disabled because it's encrypted, but the personal email is left alone. So it's a really nice technology to use. And the enrollment and overhead for MEM is really quite low. Great place to get started. Sorry about that. Got one. So we also recommend configuring device enrollment prerequisites for supported platforms. What we mean by this is in order to manage iOS devices or in order to manage Android devices, there are a few steps you have to complete to enable that. For Apple, we need to get an enrollment certificate from Apple. There's a wizard that helps you do it. It takes 5 minutes. And for Android, the company needs to create an account in order to sync. Both of these are necessary to sync with the store and be able to push apps and settings to the devices. In many cases, we'll want to also consider default compliance policies. So for every platform that you intend to support, whether it's Windows, Mac OS, iOS, or Android, we recommend a basic compliance policy so you can evaluate whether the device is suitable for connecting to the environment. And then separately, we recommend setting up a basic compliance policies so that we can check things like BitLocker and stuff. And I see the description here is wrong, so we will update that in the guide. But creating compliance policies has nothing to do with inbox rules. For those reading the slide, it has everything to do with making sure that the operating system is up to date, making sure that a password or PIN is enabled on the device, if the encryption is turned on, so forth and so on. Continuing on with the checklist, once we have our devices enrolled and we have a basic compliance policy in place, the very next step is to take control or use that to control the environment and with a conditional access policy so that we can block unsupported or unhealthy devices from the environment, or at least the more sensitive areas of the tenant. Now, this is super important if you can imagine a scenario where an end user has had their password stolen or the MFA was compromised somehow. It's very unlikely that the threat actor has their device as well. They're probably sitting using some some device they don't want to be traced to in a foreign country, and we can very easily block that scenario entirely with a conditional access policy that requires a compliant device in order to access a tenant or to access certain areas of the tenant. I also recommend we configure enterprise state roaming. This will enable the settings, favorites, and other nice things to travel with the user. Kind of a simple, easy use case to consider is, let's say the employee was working at their desk in a spreadsheet. They go to lunch or to grab a coffee, and someone needs some information from them. Enterprise state roaming is configured. They bring up their mobile device, their tablet, or their phone, and open the Excel app. Excel will, already know which document they were working on the desktop and bring it right up for them, so they don't have to hunt for it. They can quickly get to the information they were looking for. It also makes it very easy to replace devices. If we have enterprise state roaming turned on, and if you replace one device with another, a lot of the information that they were working with and working on carries over to the other device. We recommend deploying the Microsoft 365 apps at a minimum. It's a very easy thing to do in Microsoft Endpoint Manager or Intune. Also recommend deploying other apps the customer uses and having some control in the platform. This really ties to a key tenet, a very basic tenet of the CIS critical cybersecurity controls. You need to have an inventory of the software assets, and then the next step is to have control of the software assets. And one very easy way to do that is push the software to the users instead of letting them install it themselves. And the last bit is to make sure the devices get enrolled. Let's talk through some of this. We'll go through some quick demos here. First thing we're going to do is cover with Lighthouse. We're going to choose our mobility management approach and deploy the apps. So I like to show this off because Intune is extremely powerful. It's a great tool, but it's also a tool that I think a lot of partners and customers have a hard time getting started in because it's an immense set of capabilities. And with the deployment steps in Lighthouse, it makes it very easy to get started with some of the most essential tasks. So Lighthouse certainly doesn't do everything MEM does, but it's a great way to get started with some policies, especially if you're not familiar. And I always recommend partners, invest time into getting good at Endpoint Manager or get good at Intune, because it'll give you much of your day back. I've had several partners who've kind of invested some of their time to learn the tool tell me that 6 hours of their day that they used to spend chasing down tickets and responding to customer calls has been saved because they got the environment running so smoothly with Endpoint Manager policies that things kind of became automatic for the customers. So the software the customer needed was available at their fingertips. They didn't have to call and ask for someone to connect remotely to their machine to install it. If people needed new devices, they could use the autopilot feature that Zahid will talk about tomorrow. It's simply, ship a piece of hardware from an OEM or a distributor to the end user. They sign into it without the partner ever needing to touch it, and then they're up and running with all their apps, their data, and their settings in 20 or 30 minutes. And getting to that point where things run automatically is certainly desirable, because not only is the customer happier because they're able to focus on their work and not really keep asking for IT stuff, but it's great for the partner because you're delivering a lot of value without a lot of effort. So it reduces the operational complexity and the amount of work you have your level 1, level 2 techs doing on a daily basis. Give them that time back to go work on other things. Makes your partner business much more efficient and therefore much more profitable. So in order to get enrollment started, we're in Lighthouse. We're going to go back to tenants. We're going to pick the tenants we want to set up device enrollment. So we're going to pick on ONU1 again here. If I click on ONU1, as we did before, I'm going to go and have a look at the deployment plan, and I can see here, which deployment plans have been started. None are showing compliant yet. In the list here, two down below are compliant. So I want to focus on device enrollment. I have a section for it, and there's 3 different deployment steps for this. And we're just going to start with configure Azure Active Directory for joining devices. So this is easy to do in Azure Active Directory, but even easier here, especially if you don't know where the setting is. So if we click on this policy, we can read all about it. We're basically going to configure Azure Active Directory to point back to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We click deploy, we're going to get a prompt whether we want multi-factor auth configuration. And actually, I recommend leaving this as not required. And here's why. It's certainly a good idea to require MFA for enrollment, but it's a better idea to use conditional access policy than the built-in MFA requirement. This is also an official Microsoft recommendation. So if you're using conditional access, it's much better to put all policies in one place, and it's much more granular and flexible than the policy setting here. So that is why I recommend leaving this as not required, and then using a conditional access policy to set the conditions under which end users are allowed to enroll devices. Right? Many organizations are going to want to lock that down to only allow enrollment of new devices from trusted locations. That could be a corporate office or VPN connection, or we can use a temporary access pass. If a user is at home and we don't want to bother with VPN, the partner can just give them a temporary access password that will work, to get the device enrolled on a particular day. But then that password isn't good anymore, so it can't be abused. So that's it. This one's very simple. When we're ready to confirm, we press the confirm button, and we'll see the summary slide when we're complete. So for these three, we usually just continue on right down the list. So now that we've enabled enrollment in Azure Active Directory and we're pointing back to Endpoint Manager, we want to configure automatic enrollment. Another very easy deployment step. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to click on the deployment step, click on the deploy button. I have a little bit to read about here. Again, this is a pretty simple policy. In this case, we have this detected configuration screen. I wanted to explain this a little bit. So your customers may have already played with this, or your partner organization, you may have some configurations already in place. One of the goals of Lighthouse is to bring consistency to the partner business. So number one, we don't want to push settings on top of other settings that may be in use. So we're going to show you that here. If there's existing settings, we're going to tell you, number one, how many of those settings are actually compliant with this policy. If there's any settings that are not compliant, you can view those. And you have the opportunity to remediate this before we go pushing a policy, or you can actually forge ahead and let Intune take over and push its policy in place of the other ones. So this is one area where Lighthouse is getting really, really good. It's not only recognizing other policies wherever they may be, where they have settings that impact these services, but it's also we're very close to the point where now you'll be able to actually use set configurations you like that are different from this baseline in order to import those into Lighthouse so you can use them on other tenants. In this case, this is a test tenant. I've reviewed this. I'm happy with what Lighthouse is going to do, so I am going to proceed and deploy the Lighthouse setting here. And we're done with that one, and on to the next one. The last bit here is to deploy a basic health monitoring policy. I'm going to do that. Again, same thing, review it, press the deploy button. Right. We can scope this one to either to all groups, or if we wanted to, we could more narrowly scope it. If I consider deployment rings for my customers, I could push this to a deployment ring first. And it's going to look for detected configurations. In this case, there are no health policies that have the same settings this one does. I don't have any conflicts or detected configurations in the customer tenant, so I can proceed. Get our confirm screen again. When we're ready to push this into the customer tenant, click the confirm button, and we're done. We checked a few things off our list. This is, like, as I mentioned before, Intune is a very vast tool, and we have a lot of specific recommendations in the checklist. I just wanted to show how kind of easy it is to get started with enrollment. Unfortunately, a lot of the other areas of this checklist are not yet in Lighthouse. We will have to do those in Endpoint Manager. We have a little bit of guidance on each one in the downloadable guide, as well as our recommendations. And the next one I wanted to focus on is the device enrollment restrictions. I mentioned this earlier. This is a good idea to block personally owned devices from enrollment if I don't intend to do MAM on personally enrolled. That way, the MAM MDM is not an option for personal devices, but MAM is. But in order to do this one, I'd log in to the Endpoint Manager. I'm logged into Endpoint Manager as the partner. So the Security Center, Endpoint Manager, Exchange Online, etc., are fully accessible now with partner credentials. Security Center requiring GDAP. Here I'm in the Customers Endpoint Manager Admin Center as the partner, and I'm going to click on Devices on the left-hand navigation, and then way at the bottom, I'm going to click on Enrollment Device Platform Restrictions. And this is where I can set, either I can block platforms outright if I'm not ever intending to support them, or I can block the personal use of certain platforms from enrolling in MDM. That's what I'm going to do here. So for this policy, I'm going to name it block personal device enrollment MAM, and I put a little explanation of what I'm trying to accomplish here. Click next, and I'll pick my platform settings. So this is a Android setting, and I'm gonna allow this platform to enroll for MDM, but personally owned devices are going to be blocked, and then we'll push MAM for those. We can scope this policy if we want to. Since this is SMB, not using scope tags, it's not very common for our SMB customers. I'm going to assign this to all groups in the tenant or particular groups. So in this case, I have to assign this to a group. In this case, I want this to apply to all my employees. So I'm going to click the Add Groups button. I'm going to assign it to all the employees. And we have a review screen here where we get to check all the settings before we apply this policy. And we're done. So now we have blocked the personal enrollment of Android devices into Intune so that they have to use MAM. And we can check a couple more things off of our list here. So. All right, I'm not covering everything in endpoint enrollment. It is in the guide, but we're not going to demo it all today. I did want to spend more time on endpoint protection since this is security, and you'll hear a lot more about Intune and Endpoint Manager in the technical training if you take that tomorrow. So getting into endpoint protection, which has been my favorite topic probably for the last couple of years now. Checklist item number 1 is set up Microsoft Defender for Business. That will make sure that your customer has, we explained yesterday the difference between antivirus and EDR. Your customer will have antivirus on and controlled by MDB. They'll have EDR on and controlled by MDD. We'll have threat and vulnerability management turned on, which will detect misconfigurations, vulnerabilities in the operating system, cross-platform. It'll detect vulnerabilities in the applications that your customer is using. It'll turn on attack surface reduction rules and start making recommendations on how to improve the security of these endpoints, and then making sure if the endpoints do suffer a breach that we do something about it and stop that breach and respond to it as quickly as possible. Next on the list is attack surface reduction rules. So these are rules to turn off potentially exploitable features that aren't commonly used, especially in SMB. And this is stuff like macros executing, child processes. It's things like JavaScript executing child process. A lot of times it's unusual for an SMB to need that, and there's usually not a good reason for leaving these features on if the customer doesn't need it. And we can use telemetry in the tenant if we're not sure and we're worried about breaking. If we know the customer uses macros or uses things that could be impacted by hardening devices with ASR. We have telemetry in the tenant and the ability to audit events, so we can sort of turn on a switch for each rule and see what would happen if this was turned on before actually turning on, which is a powerful tool. To be honest, for SMB customers, much of the time, it's usually, it seems acceptable to just inform the customer of what we recommend, get their approval for the particular, so maybe a subset of the rules, 4 or 5 rules at a time, turn those on. In many cases, customers are okay with that approach, as long as they have assurances that they can be turned back off if there was a problem. And what I found for most SMB customers is most of these attack surface reduction rules are not business impacting, and they're shutting off possible attack vectors that malware and other things could potentially use. In most cases, or in almost all cases, I recommend turning on BitLocker. This is one area of the guide where we've gotten very granular and put every single setting in there, because the BitLocker policies I've found can be confusing for some partners and customers, and there's a few key pieces in there that I think are important. Number one is pushing the BitLocker policy in silent mode. The reason I like this is I think most end users don't know what the settings mean, and so if we're asking them, if they want a backup key or questions like that, they usually don't know. It's just much easier, much more appropriate, in my opinion, to just set that up for them, so they don't have to make the choices. Number two, I think it's really important to have backup keys and have those backup keys stored in Azure Active Directory. So should something happen, they change their hardware and get, BitLocker requires a recovery key, that you have that recovery key and you can provide it to the end user over the phone or something like that. Should, something happen with the encryption where they can't, boot the device or something like that. That's pretty important. I like to set that all up in the policy so it's done properly. I don't have to worry about it, and it just works. We can configure compliance policy integration with, sorry about that. We can configure compliance policy integration with Defender for Business. So that will make sure that, I'm sorry, I have the description wrong here, but we're basically talking about here is we can set conditional access policies to fire, or we can set a compliance rule that will mark the device not compliant if it doesn't have a clear or low risk rating in Defender for Business. And there's a vast number of other security policies through device configuration policies that we can do on the device. So if you're used to using things like group policy, you can control many of the same features of operating systems using Endpoint Manager. And so there's probably a list of other things you'd like to do with the devices that we've made room for here in the guide. Let's get started with the demo. We're going to set up Microsoft Defender for Business, make sure that the firewall policy is set and configured by us. We want to make sure that the antivirus is set and configured, by us, with real-time protection on, EDR and block mode, all the cool features. We want to make sure the users can't turn it off. We want to make sure tamper protection is on, so threat actors, if they did get a foothold in the device, have a very difficult time turning the antivirus off, or the EDR catches them. Most cases, I want to turn on email notifications. So not only do I get security alerts if AV or EDR picks something up, but it's also a good idea to get vulnerabilities queued up, because this is one of the areas that I think MDB brings a lot of value to partners, because it shines a light on all the vulnerabilities that were already there, right? So for a lot of customers that did not have a vulnerability scanning solution before, probably haven't kept up to date with all their patching. So as soon as you install it, you're going to have a large number of things to take care of, which is good for security. Those problems were there before, but it's good to actually know about them so you can do something about it. And then the doing something about it is really where the partners come in, because the new vulnerabilities are discovered every day across the apps, especially with apps like Adobe. And it just creates the opportunity for you as a partner to, number one, solve these problems for your customer in an efficient manner, and then report back to them and say, yeah, when we started, you had 2,500 vulnerabilities across the organization. We did these 10 steps and we took 500 off the table. 500 are the most important, and you can just keep rolling with a service like that. And then, of course, we want automated investigation and remediation turned on. As far as I know, it's not. It is on by default, and I don't believe it's possible to turn off. I mark it here just to make sure to reemphasize the point that detecting a problem isn't very useful if it isn't immediately dealt with. And so MDB does have automated investigation remediation capability. So let's get into it. For this step, I'm again going to use Lighthouse because it's available to us. So if I want to turn on MDB for all of my customers, I can do it from within Lighthouse. Lighthouse will do the exact same thing as the configuration would do in the customer tenant itself. This just gives you the ability to turn it on for your customers without having to log into each and every tenant to do so. So as before, I'm going to click on tenants, and I'm going to choose the tenants I want to turn on Defender for Business for. So in this example, I'm going to pick on Anya one again. And as before, I bring up an overview of the tenant, and I can see a little bit about what's going on in that tenant, which services are managed. And if there was deployments in progress, I would see some statistics on those. I'm going to click into deployment plan to interact with the Defender for Business steps. When I click on that, you can see there's a provisioning step and a onboarding devices step within Defender for Business. Now, if you use the tool interactively in a tenant and you go into Defender for Business and there's sort of this getting started period with a cup of coffee, that's a provisioning step. And we're basically preparing the tenant for use with Defender for Business, which means some old legacy tenants need some internal services upgraded and need to get some things moved onto the Microsoft 365 Defender service. That's really what's going on when you do this step. We can do it with provisioning here. So if I click on that provisioning policy, I'm given the option as before to deploy it. If you notice, this one was already compliant, but it's just because I ran it once without grabbing my screenshots. But it's the same process, whether it's compliant or we're doing it for the first time. I'm going to click deploy, and we'll review it. There really are no settings for MDB, but we will get a review of detected configuration. So if my customers already ran the wizard, or I've already configured some stuff, or maybe I was playing around in Intune and tried wiring this up and was unsuccessful, the detected configurations will show you where configurations exist that you may want to go delete before you do this. You can remediate those. Or if they're already compliant, you really don't need to do anything, which is the case here. I'm actually compliant. So running through this wizard won't actually do anything. But we're just doing it for demo purposes. So I can see my existing settings are compliant. I'm going to proceed anyway, just push it again. I click next. It's going to ask me to confirm and deploy. And it's basically, in this example, we're just pushing the same settings that were there before back down to the tenant. Okay, now Anya 1 is ready for enrollment, which is the next step. So now that their tenant is ready for enrollment of the devices, this next deployment policy will onboard the devices, push the firewall policy, the antivirus policy, configure EDR, and the other features that are configured by the configuration wizard. So it's very, very easy. As before, I'm going to interact with this step. I can read about it if I want. I'm ready to deploy. I can do it. We'll have the same, I'll have a little bit of a review. It's going to go check the tenant to see if this is already done. In this example, I haven't not done this step yet. So you can see there's two settings that are not compliant. This is just going to fix that for us. I click next. I've now configured this tenant for deployment of MDB. So all the devices enrolled in the tenant will automatically get the onboarding instructions to enroll into Microsoft Defender for Business. The Sense agent or the Sense service will fire up on the device and it'll start communicating. And now we have EDR running on the box. We'll have antivirus fully on and controlled by the tenant, so the customer can't, end users can't turn it off themselves. The firewall policies will be on and controlled by the tenant. We'll start the threat and vulnerability scans will start right away and start reporting back in a number of hours back to the tenant, so I can see what's going on with the customer, and we're off to the races. I've gotten this far in the checklist, so I did want to take a pause. Number one for questions, and then number two, I want to do a little bit more interactive demo with MDB so I can show off what this thing can do for those who haven't seen it yet. So if you, team, are there any questions pending in the chat before I start doing an interactive demo?
Let me see. I mean, there are a couple, but I want to see which one could be. Let's see. Okay. So one question we have, like SentinelOne does, if there is a false positive, you can roll back the device to its original state before SentinelOne removed the file application.
Yeah, so that the rollback functionality in SentinelOne is unique to SentinelOne. We protect from that scenario, but we do it in a different way. So Defender for Business won't let the ransomware encrypt files. Whereas SentinelOne has a different approach. They're going to use a snapshot of a prior snapshot of the device and restore the device to a prior state. So if we're beating SentinelOne in the industry reports, but that is one feature that is unique to them, and I don't think we're going to. Well, as far as I know, we don't have plans to do that because we solve. Product group tells me we're just solving for that same risk a different way.
Okay. Yeah, and one I think popular question which we get a lot of time with is with Defender. If the client want to use a third-party antivirus in conjunction with Defender EDR, is this a good approach, or how that could be a good approach? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a good approach from the sense that you're going to limit the visibility of the EDR. So can you do it? Yes. But I'd recommend in that case, if you really want to run AV, a separate AV with AV EDR, make sure the Defender AV can also run, because a lot of the capability is actually, like the EDR agent is leveraging the Defender AV for some of the workload, right? And so, like in particular, those attack surface reduction rules, if I want to say block a macro from spawning another process, that's the Defender agent doing that, not EDR. Because as we talked yesterday, the antivirus is like locking your front door, and another analogy is antivirus is the workhorse for a lot of things related to pre-breach security on the device, so preventing problems. The EDR is like the control panel, or it's the security cameras that are watching everything all the time, recording everything all the time, shipping that off to the cloud, and then responding, if the door is broken and the alarm goes off. But your mileage may vary. I personally installed like SentinelOne and Defender and MDB side by side. I didn't have any problems. Where I would be concerned is some third-party antivirus will disable Defender AV or put it in passive mode. And in that case, you're going to limit what your solution is able to do. So in those cases, I would work to get Defender turned back on at a minimum.
Yeah, makes sense. And also why you want to pay 2 times, right? Well, you already have the functionality. So
yeah, and then there's the paying 2 times for sure.
Right. And one question I have is let's say a customer has 3 BP licenses, right? And then they're eligible to Lighthouse registration, which we said, they should be there. And then let's say if they have other licenses other than BP in the tenant, so are they able to see, all other licenses? They can manage it other than BP if they have licenses there.
From a Lighthouse perspective, yes, they can manage the tenant. So in order to use a Lighthouse on a tenant today, you need at least one business premium, one MDB, or I think they either support E3 now or will support E3, right? Now,
they do know, yeah. E3 and E5 both know, yeah. Yeah.
There's some caveats here, though. So many of the services in Lighthouse depend on Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So in the case where, like, let's say I have a business basic license and I have a business premium, I have 2 users, Lighthouse will let me manage both. I can manage the MFA and the authentication properties. I can see risky sign-ons from the BP user and any detections a basic user would have. But that basic user, if they don't have an add-on Intune license, I won't have the device inventory, and I won't have like the ability to push software to it. So you'll have a bit of a mixed result if you have mixed licensing, depending on what the end user supports. So Lighthouse only has visibility into the services that the user is licensed to. It doesn't have like additional functionality, and quite a bit of what Lighthouse does today depends on Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Not all of it though. So the GDAP works for anyone, any customer that Lighthouse can see, even if those tenants aren't or showing as ineligible. The GDAP wizard will work for them. The user management, risky users, and other features related to user settings should work across any tenant or any tenant license type. And then the things that won't work will be if things that do Intune things if the end user does not have an Intune license, either as part of Business Premium, E3, or added on somehow. But if they had Business Basic with EMS or something, they would have the Intune and everything would just work just fine.
Thank you.
All right, any more questions from the audience?
I mean, there are some, right? Like it's, yeah, there was one, I think maybe during the discussion, like, I don't know if how much it will be, we can understand that is there a 2023 version of the practical guide to securing work from anywhere? Yes. Using MS365 Business Premium, yeah.
Yeah, there is a 2023 version, and that's actually the version I'm showing. Unfortunately, the upload to cloud partners is still in the works. I was expecting it to be done before we started. So the links that you have today, aka.ms/SMB security guide and SMB security checklist, will have the 2023 version as soon as those files get uploaded into the cloud partners. So I'm expecting it. I was expecting it before we started, and I was told it's still going to happen today. So if you can just bear with us, those links will work shortly. And then also you'll see the Business Premium Playbook site will get an update, and you'll see new names for them probably also today.
Excellent. Right. Thank you so much.
So let's go to some interactive demos. These are my favorite kind because they it's a little bit of a gamble. The demo guys are going to be fine or nice to us today. So I'm back in the M365 Lighthouse that we did with static demos here. This is let's take a look at a little bit more of what MDB can do. So in my as you might have saw in the previous demo, we had our GDAP wizard here. On this homepage is security incident queue. And I'm hoping we have an incident that I staged earlier. So a live demo will tell us here if we're going to have one. Okay. Let me show a few other areas of Defender for Business. I'm going to switch into customer tenant because my incident queue has not updated yet. I'm going to refresh it while we wait. Let's refresh that, give it a moment, and go look at a few things. So I'm in the security portal of Anya One. I can do this either as customer admin or as partner admin, as long as I have GDAP set up. And let's have a look at what we get when we have Defender for Business deployed. So Defender for Business, most of the components show up here under endpoints. And the first thing I wanted to walk through is the threat and vulnerability management, because I think this is one of the most useful things for partners that is going to drive service revenue, right? And if you think about what's going on with your customers, I mean, it's certainly great to have EDR, and we want the thing, the software alert when they have an incident. But it's, it's again going back to our, someone breaking into a home analogy. If you lock your front door, the number of times your lock is going to be broken is hopefully never or very infrequently. And this is the same thing with if you have EDR and a good antivirus, the number of times you actually have a real security breach should be never or very infrequent, right? It's a very sophisticated attack. But what will happen is you'll get lots of vulnerabilities on a daily basis because software, needs to be up to date. Or, so new vulnerabilities are found on a daily basis is a better way to put this. So in my threat and vulnerability dashboard, I can get a typical Microsoft dashboard view of what's going on. And you can see there's some security recommendations here. and there's a little red bug, which means there's an exploitable issue in this tenant. If I hover over the bug, I can see exactly what it is. And in this case, I have a verified local privilege escalation exploit is publicly available. That means this is kind of a big deal. There's an exploit on at least one of my machines and is publicly exploitable. And I sort of set this up intentionally to have something to show today. Because if I'm keeping things up to date, I shouldn't have too many of these unless it's a 0 day or something very recent. But I intentionally let a device get out of date so I could show you some cool stuff. So on the left-hand side here, I'm going to start with the weaknesses tab. You can see there's a bunch of things here, but I like to show weaknesses first. This is the eye-opening report for your customer. So now this is a demo tenant with one device, but you can see I have 67 vulnerabilities and 3 exploitable and 4 critical. On a real tenant you've just deployed this to, like say with 25 or 50 computers, I typically see the vulnerabilities in the thousands and the exploitable or criticals in the dozens, right? Unless they're really already, on top of patch, which many SMB customers are not, to be perfectly honest. So in the week, and I like to just grab this top part when I start because I can, show my customer, right? Hey, if you have 2,500 vulnerabilities and whatever, right? And then go do some stuff and come back to them with another report a week, a month, or whatever, some amount of time later, and to say, hey, look what we've done for you, Miss Customer. We're doing, we're knocking out all these things. As of today, we have a partner value report in public or private or public preview that actually does this for you. But for that, we would screenshot this or screenshot the top part. But there's actually a emailable, printable report in preview that you make that even much easier. So this is a great place to start to see what's going on in the tenant. Again, in real tenants, these numbers are usually quite high and alarming. And I can look down the list, but this list of stuff usually isn't critically important, but I can see my red bugs here. I can see that, if I wanted to read all about what these issues were, I could. But the next most interesting piece is the recommendations. So one of the things the TVM module does for you automatically is prioritize these recommendations based on a number of elements. Number one, what is the likelihood of a breach? So it's going to float the ones that have publicly exploitable things to the top of the list. But it's not the only factor. The number of devices exposed also push things to the top of the list, and the value of those devices exposed, again, pushes it to the top of the list. So for example, an unpatched server is going to be much more important to solve right away than an unpatched desktop. So if we had servers in this environment, and those servers had exploits, especially exploitable ones, top of the list, right? And so as the partner, you can simply work from the top down and start solving problems. You don't, in most cases, attackers need 2 things to really cause a problem: opportunity and time. You're going to take away their opportunity starting at the top of the list, because the top of this list are the most opportune things to work on. And so if I click on one of these, I'll look, I can see here in my intentional, this demo tenant has precisely 1 device and it's intentionally out of date. You can see that Office is out of date. If I want to see which devices it is, it's, our friend Anya's only computer. And if I wanted to see exactly, which of those weaknesses updating Office would solve, I can see that here. So working down the list, I can see this, we don't have Mac OS or iOS in this environment, but if we did, and those are out of date, especially Apple just had a pretty big vulnerability, those would be up here at the top. But we can see we need to upgrade some applications and need to upgrade Chrome. And then after we get past these 5 updates, so these are the important ones, you'll see these pieces here, block all Office apps. So this is attack surface reduction. So one of the really nice things is you don't have to go figure out attack surface reduction rules and which one's important on your own. TVM will show you. So if you're not sure where to start with attack surface reduction, you just look in the recommendations here and you have it. I can also, there's a few other elements like timeline and inventories that are somewhat interesting, but the recommendations and weaknesses is usually where I start. But another interesting area of the MDB is the tutorials. So a lot of times partners and customers want to see what happens when they do have malware that gets past antivirus. So we have some simulations that are designed to get past the antivirus and kick off EDR. And so we have one that's a document drops backdoor scenario. It's a weaponized macro. You can read the simulation here. If you click on this link, it will bring up the instructions on how to run this. I won't read this to you, but the important for the too long, don't want to read crowd, you download the file, put it on a device, and then open the weaponized Word document with this password to unencrypt it. Say yes to all the warning prompts, and the macro will launch and should fire off or kick off EDR. Sometimes AV catches it because the nature of this, like occasionally this gets put into a signature that antivirus catches, and my understanding is the product group kind of works to kind of keep advancing it so that it usually works and gets past AV. The other one in the list is the PowerShell script. So this is an example of a fileless attack where we just run a script much like an attacker would. It's going to pull down some code and try to do a process injection. And both of these are pretty real world. We can do other tutorials that are not included here, like from Attack IQ. But these give you a sense of what the EDR can do, and they are quite real world. I was just working with a customer last week that had suffered a breach based on Lemon Duck because they hadn't updated their Exchange server. Lemon Duck was able to get on the device, use a fileless attack to download another Trojan to embed itself. They were able to turn off antivirus, and then interestingly enough, like Lemon Duck actually patched the device itself to keep it from being picked up on a vulnerability scan, and then really deeply embedded reinfection scripts, not just in the scheduler, but like deep into the WMI event handler. So fortunately, like the customer didn't have MDE, they didn't have MDB turned on at the time. So when we talked to them, the first thing we did was put Defender for Business on it because they couldn't. What they'd done when they compromised the box, they had done something really clever, and they had configured the malware reinfection script not only to run in the WI event handler, so it wasn't obvious where it was running, but it was actually injecting a fileless attack into another process to avoid detection. So that once they had antivirus turned on, it could see what was going on, but they were having a heck of a time figuring out where it was coming from. And MDB picked it up immediately, showed them that it was WMI, and then down to the process level. That was really, really nice. All right, moving on. So moving on from vulnerability management, if we want to get into the settings across the organization, I can do that in settings, get to the endpoints section, and the endpoint section is MDB. Normally, partners and customers don't need to mess with these settings. The software is designed to work out of the box, but a lot of times people ask, well, where are the settings? And what settings might be interesting to me? So let's go through it. Out of the box, automated investigation is turned on. We have EDR running in block mode. So all the important settings are already configured for you. The Intune connection is on. This is what we did when we ran that configuration wizard through Intune. But there are some enforcement scope will become interesting to you if you want to, if you bought the Microsoft Defender for Business for Servers version. Now, in this case, we have a new tenant, so servers are checked by default. Older tenants might not have this checked. In this example, we're using Intune as Business Premium. I don't really need to concern myself with onboarding because it's automatic as long as the device is joined to Azure Active Directory. So as long as I join the device to Azure Active Directory, either by signing in when I receive the device or using Intune Autopilot, or on an existing device, just joining it work in school, it will join Azure Active Directory. It will get Defender for Business automatically. But if I'm having other scenarios, let's say my customer is using Active Directory and group policy, and I haven't configured them for hybrid device join yet, I can go in here, pick the operating system I want. So for example, Windows 10 and Windows 11, and the deployment method I want. If I want to do a script or group policy, we have options, and they work equally well. So one very valid option is to wire up, Intune or hybrid device join, which is a feature that connects Active Directory and Intune, and let Intune push MDB onto the devices. Or I can go the other way. It's completely valid. I can set up a group policy that pushes MDE to the devices first, and then has MDE join the device to Intune if that's what I want. Or I could just put the EDR in. So you have a lot of options. This is where you get to all this stuff. If I just want to do some testing and I want to just locally install a device, I can pick local script, download the onboarding package, run that off a USB stick or remote to the device, put in my RMM tool. If I want to do a group policy, just pick group policy. It will give you the instructions for that, plus an onboarding package that's appropriate for deployment with the group policy, so forth and so on. If I want to run a detection test, here's the script I can run interactively on the device to test to make sure that it's working. If I need to offboard devices for some reason, the instructions are similar there. And then we get have the ability to adjust the policies if we need to. And demo gods might be messing with me here. We'll move on. If I wanted to adjust the firewall policy for the environment or the antivirus policy, that is done here under built-in protection. I don't know why that's not coming up, but it is a demo tenant. Email notifications are configured there it goes. If I want to configure email notification, that is done here, which you certainly should. You can separately configure security alerts and vulnerability notifications. Vulnerability is fairly noisy. It does need to be addressed, but it's not the same thing as a security alert. So I usually recommend having two different distribution lists. One where security alerts are acted upon immediately. The vulnerability notifications can probably get queued up and managed on a more regular or routine basis. Something that is not configured by the wizard is web content filtering. If we want that, we can create a policy that blocks certain undesirable content, like we can block adult content. We can block gambling, kind of the normal stuff we would want if we. This is off by default, but some customers depend on this, or some customers might be already paying for something like this. So it's another area where MDB can add a lot of value. All right, I did want to walk through incident queue. So this is the bread and butter of the EDR portion. So in the real world, you should, if in a reasonably well-managed environment, you should not have a lot of incidents. But it's super important to understand the incident flow, and these tie back to these tutorials that I showed you. So I ran the tutorial on a device, and these are the two examples that come with it. The multi-stage incident involving initial access and discovery, that's our weaponized macro. And the suspicious WMI process creation on one endpoint, that's our fileless attack using a PowerShell script. So I click on an incident, I'm brought into the incident view. This is one of the most powerful features of Defender for Business. We're taking all the alerts related to the incident. Remember that sort of security cameras are running all the time, right? There's a mountain of data to sort through. And most security analysts and IT generalists don't want to spend a lot of time weaving together all the alerts, especially in a complex attack. This is very simple simulated attack, but imagine a real attack on multiple devices. You'd have alerts everywhere. This will automatically correlate alerts that are using the same attack kill chain and are related to each other. So I can look down the list and see all the individual things that happened. If I want to replay the attack, I can hit the play button here to kind of see how and what happened when and in what order, especially if something was spreading from device to device. If I need more information about a particular alert, I can click on that. So for example, in this case, PowerShell dropped a suspicious file, and I'm curious about that file or exactly what it was. I can look at the alert, and I can get the detail on that individual alert. Here. So for example, this is our security camera, remind you, right? So it's recording everything even before an attack is realized so that we can piece the whole thing together. So in this example, Word started up, it executed a script, PowerShell ran, and we can see here that the window was hidden. If I want to see the actual PowerShell command, I can highlight over, I can see what the actual code that was run. I can see that PowerShell executed a suspicious process, so forth and so on. If I'm interested in which devices were impacted, I can just see the device view in the simulation. So we just saw it on one device. Similar to users, I can see which users were impacted, apps. You can see what was done. So I can see that, you know, the main things that happened is PowerShell dropped the suspicious file. That file was removed, it was remediated, removed from the device. A scheduled task was created. No threats found there. And if I look through evidence and response, I can get all the individual evidence I need. So for example, the exact files that were used, I can see where they were here and what happened to them. I can see which processes were involved. If command and control, you know, if this is a real attack and this, you know, let's say it was the lemon duck thing that happened last week, I would see which command and control IP addresses were involved. I could see what other Trojans were downloaded on the device, so that I have enough information that if I need to go check to make sure this didn't happen anywhere else, if I had other unpatched machines, I could at least have a look and see what happened here and go apply that somewhere else. All right, so that's a kind of a live demo of MDB. I'm going to kind of come back to the questions and see if we have any Q&A prompted from that discussion.
Okay, let me see. I think many of them we answered before live, but let's see. Let's see. Yeah, I think we answered that live.
Yeah, I can see the queue. So Mark is asking, partners can now get into the MDB portal to manage clients that have GDAP enabled.
Yeah.
Who the MSP or the client's tenant. So Mark, this means that you as the MSP are logged in as, you know, into your CSP, your MSP tenant. You can get into the, you know, you can use that credential to access the customer security portal. So you don't need to go create a global admin for yourself in the customer security portal to get to the security center. That's the new functionality with GDAP in the security center. All right, we answered that one. So someone has a question, what happens, or is an alternative third-party app does not support modern authentication? So a couple things here. With regard to conditional access policies that affect authentication, you can absolutely set exclusions. So in the examples, you know, in the old examples of, you know, I needed to use legacy auth like IMAP to get to a tenant, you know, you could easily create an exclusion for that within conditional access for the user that needed it. Now, Microsoft is I believe we are done with, we have blocked the like IMAP and legacy authentication across the board, except in corner cases where you know, the support ticket has been raised, and then there's nothing that can be done about that except, you know, what I've seen people, you know, either update their devices or stand up, you know, an authenticated relay to be able to handle like unencrypted connection or unauthenticated unencrypted connections to email. They really have that requirement, and then, you know, have the relay server communicating with Office 365 as a sort of workaround to the problem. So question on MFA with the number matching, will businesses have time to phase it in? It's coming. I do believe it's been extended a little bit. I haven't kept on the latest, but I really recommend, you know, getting your customers aware. If in the Entra portal, we have, you know, templates on informing the users ready to go, so you can do a mail merge. I would start preparing your customers early, because another area where we as the, you know, partner readiness team don't have direct visibility or any control at all on when these things happen. And they are happening with good reason. I mean, one of the reason why we're pushing stronger MFA is to have phishing resistant MFA, mostly because you know, the threat actors have started to get good at fooling users into approving malicious MFA attempts, like they're spamming their MFA device or something like that. So we're trying to combat that before it causes problems for our customers. So LES, is this similar to Defender for Endpoint? And the answer is yes. Defender for Business is based on MDEP2. we created a different package of the same product. So there's the same technology. We're really delivering our enterprise grade technology in MDE P2 in MDB. It is the same product. There are differences though. So number one, MDE stores 6 months of raw data. So what you're seeing here is incident data, and that is retained in MDB. Raw data is everything else. And so for the everything else category where incidents weren't picked up by MDE or MDB, we don't store that for small business, mostly because it's a use case that most small businesses aren't interested in paying for. That requires a fairly sophisticated cybersecurity analyst sort of look through the sort of haystack of data looking for compromise that were not detected by EDR, which is rare and it's expensive, and most SMBs and MSPs have told us they're not very interested in doing that themselves or paying for the software that has that capability. Number one. Number two, we've added the simplification and the ease of use pieces you've seen. So the config wizard and the sort of the having everything working out of the box is unique to MDB. If you have MDE, you've got some configuration to do. And the two product differences is one is the retention of raw data, which I've mentioned, and then the number two is that MDE P2 allows the customer to call threat experts and ask questions. That is not included in MDB. Those are the only two differences. Otherwise, it's the same product, with the exception of, I think there's a few minor differences. For example, MDE has a legacy component called device groups, which MDB won't use because they're switching to Active Directory groups. It's one of the minor things that don't exist, but for good reason. They just didn't want to bring a legacy technology they're sunsetting anyway into the new product. Where can we download the more advanced script for determining SPF DKIM DMARC DNS records? I wrote that one myself. If you would like that script or a copy of mine, I'd be more than happy to send it to you. My email is in the front of the guide, so just shoot me an email. I'll reply back with my DNS script. That's DNS script is the same one to use. I build the hands-on labs. So we need we create DNS records for our hands-on lab users. So I wrote that. It's set up tens of thousands of tenants with the correct DNS records. Seb asks a great question. It's great to see the vulnerabilities in the report, but how do we fix them, right? So it's a good question because you bring up a great point. Threat and vulnerability management today highlights all the vulnerabilities, and we have the ability to fix Microsoft vulnerabilities. You can just turn on auto update policies, but what do you do about the third-party stuff? Today, there's nothing in the product that actually does it for you. We have a remediation workflow where you can ask somebody to go take care of it, but that's usually not very interesting to partners. But there are third-party tools. PatchMyPC, both PatchMyPC and Scatman, I think PatchMyPC just bought Scatman, can auto-patch for you. And the way that works is you plug that third-party into your customer's Intune. Last time I talked to PatchMyPC, I think they were charging MSPs about 50 cents an endpoint. And then what they do is their staff creates the update packages for you, but for the most common pieces of software they see. So there's no guarantee they're going to write everything, but software that is very common and needs updating, like Adobe and Google and Dell, the Dell desktop stuff that kind of comes with their laptops, things like that, they're putting into their catalog, and then they put it in one time, and then all of your customers can just pull that down. And they'll actually, if you configure it, they'll push it into each of your customers' Intune for you. So, for example, if it has the Dell stuff that kind of comes with the laptops and it sees it's out of date and needs an update and they have an update, it's automatic. So there are solutions for that. And then I know our product group is also looking at more of an auto patch solution for third party. I have no idea if and when that will come out, but keep on the lookout for that because they've definitely recognized the need for partners to be able to patch at scale, right? And the problem, one MSP, if they package an app and solves it, right, it doesn't help another MSP. So there's definitely room in the market for a central source of updates for third parties, but it can be a bit complicated because some of the vendors, for it's paid software, and they do not make their patches available publicly, which sort of complicates the problem a little bit. Now, if your customers are using similar paid software, let's say you're specializing in healthcare and they all use Epic, or architects, and they all use a certain version of AutoCAD, you certainly can create the update package, one time for Intune and then push it to all your customers. That is very doable via existing automation. Anonymous says, the reason we used to create a customer dedicated global admin for our use was because of the security compliance portals. Yep, so that is fixed. I still recommend the break class. There are still some things you will need as of today. There's still a few things that you need global admin to do. We solved the security portal, but I know like the Teams, the SharePoint migration tool, the SPMT, is only available to a direct global admin. That's one of the minor things. Like, so if you're going to do like a file migration for the customer, migrate their on-prem file server into Teams or something like that using SPMT, you'll need to use an admin on their tenant. And there's a documented page. Might have searched a little bit, but part of learn.microsoft.com has the list of everything that does and does not work as far as like partner global admin and customer global admin, and that list is getting smaller. So that same team who brought you Lighthouse is working on that list and working all the different pieces to try to make it so that the role is the same. So you don't need to go create, customer global admins anymore. Anonymous asks if there's a server license to run on a server, and the answer is yes. So for users, MDB is included in Business Premium, or in the US, you can buy it standalone for $3 per user per month. That standalone works on, Active Directory. It can work on Google customers, work on Business Basic. It's truly standalone, so you don't need any other Microsoft 365 to run it. But servers are a bit unique, is that you must, for servers, there is $3 per server per month. And it's very cost effective for EDR. It's a great product. And the protection works on servers exactly the same way. So it's the exact same product. It is not Defender for Cloud. It is not MDEP2. Those can be used with MDB, but they cost more. So I would recommend starting with the MDB server product. Yeah, talking about the Dell stuff, the update for drivers is coming to Intune. You're right, there's a lot of cool stuff coming into Intune. I think we just shipped remote help where you can get remote control of end users' computers. So it's a lot of new, I've been hearing a lot of new things coming into Intune, so I definitely stay tuned to that. All right, I think we have a break. So it is 3:46 on my timer. Let's see, I've got 12:52 on my time. So let's take a break for 8 minutes, and we'll come back at 1 o'clock Eastern time. We're almost done, you guys. We're going to wrap this up. I've just got a little bit more of the checklist to cover. No more demos unless someone wants to see anything more. And then I've got the link to sign up for the hands-on labs for next week and the week after, and our closing slides. So come back 7 minutes from now, and we'll continue on. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A chat. All right, I've been told I should put a break slide up, so I'm going to do that. One moment.